Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. As you guys know, we're on a new season. We're doing apologetics this season. And this episode is going to be focused on racism and response to racism. And we're going to have George Yancey on, mainly because he's written a recent book called A Unifying Alternative to Color Blindness and Anti-Racism. The main title is Beyond Racial Division, and it's published by IVP Press. So we'll have George help us with this conversation today. If you go to our show notes and hit the IVP Press link, you can get a copy for yourself of this book that George is mainly going to be referencing, or we're mainly going to be referencing. Both Peter and I just recently read. So we're bringing that kind of into this conversation, not limited to this book, but we're going to use it. And then some other references on how to contact us, how to find a local Reformed or confessional church to call home or reference to somebody else. So click that link, type in your zip code, find the closest churches near you. You can find out ways to how to stay up to date with what we're up to. Future episodes, things that are going on a day-to-day basis, communication, or if you just want to email us, it's guiltgracepod@gmail.com. You can go to Twitter and Instagram, same handle @guiltgracepod. You can go to YouTube and type in Guilt, Grace, Gratitude Podcast and hit subscribe. These conversations are automatically have a video attached to them. So if that's more your thing, YouTube, we got you there too. So other than that, we have a thing called Bridge Builders. So you heard me say Logos Bible Software is our main sponsor. So there are an example of a bridge builder, and then halfway through this episode, you'll hear some words from some of our sponsors who are other bridge builders. But if you're just most of you guys are just an individual like you and I, and you wanted to donate to the show, you could do that too and become a bridge builder. So you click that Patreon link and you can see the different levels of giving and how to do that. If that fits you and you're able to do it without taking away your giving at your local church. So we will jump into this episode here and let Peter further introduce George Yancey today.
Yeah, we have Dr. George Yancey, who's professor at the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor University, specializing in race, ethnicity, and religion, which is part of the reason why we have him on the show today. Works to promote collaborative conversation or collaborative communication, which is actually a big theme in this book as well, as a solution to racial unrest. His books include Compromising Scholarship, One Faith No Longer, Hostile Environment, Beyond Racial Gridlock, and Transcending Racial Barriers, amongst a bunch of different articles that he's written and a couple organizations that he helps as well. So thanks for coming on and talk about this topic, Dr. Yancey.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. We read your work. I've read a couple other things. I was pretty sure I read some stuff at Westminster about your work. But maybe first, before we get into our questions, maybe tell our audience a bit about yourself, your interests, your background, and what you currently do.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been writing on race and ethnicity for quite a while, although I did take a long break. So about 25 years ago, I guess, I started writing on race ethnicity to a Christian audience and academically studying and doing research on that topic. About 2010, I decided I hadn't had enough writing about race and ethnicity. So I decided I wanted to work on other things. And that's where I wrote some of the other stuff that you cited, on compromising scholarship and such. 2020, the summer of Floyd and Albury, God kind of got me back into doing racial issues. I thought I was done, but God said no. And that's sort of where I positioned myself to write this book, Beyond Racial Division, where I, looked at some of the changes that happened and so updated my approach, but also looked at some of the research that's out there. And so that's where I'm at today.
Awesome. Yeah, because it's for those who are looking at this book or looking at reading more about racism, racial issues, all this stuff, it's an extremely well-researched book, and it's not just like kind of anecdotal. This is what I think, but it's research, which I think is really helpful for those coming into this. You can go to different resources that he pulls from, and different studies that he pulls from. But I mean, I really appreciated that which anecdotes are great, but like there's a lot of solid research put into this that you can look into and say, okay, this is where he gets it from. Maybe this is something I can look into myself as well.
Yeah, I am a social scientist, and so I do want to pull from research. I'm a Christian, and so I pull from theology. And
Yep.
well, there is a place for the antidote, but yeah, I definitely want to. I want people to know it's not just me thinking; it's what other people have done with the research that we're looking at too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and this question might be a little redundant, but just think of it as more peeling the onion back on on Peter's first question. So, with your background, you explained you're also with your Christian faith, and you are Christian here in focus as well. So, you are a believer, a fellow brother in Christ, and so a little bit more about the recent book. What pushed you to write a book on the topic of racial division and better way forward, and some of the maybe content that's in the book?
Yeah, maybe to add on to that real quick, like, because I know you've written on it 20 years before, so maybe like what got you into the very first place, and also what got you into writing this book as well?
Well, the thing that really got me involved with race in the first place was a broken relationship. I grew up and I felt that, yeah, I'm Black, and yes, I faced racism growing up. But I also felt that, I wasn't a slave, I wasn't living Jim Crow, so I'll face racism and I'll overcome it. And, I got a college degree, first one in my family, was going to grad school, was successful there. And then I fell for a woman, and her mom, for lack of a term, was just a racist. And so I felt, well, I could win her over, but I couldn't win her over. And that experience, I realized, was a very important turning point in my life, because it showed me just how pernicious racism is, and that you can't always overcome it. And that got me into studying racism, understanding it. Understanding as a Christian, back to some of my Christian friends around me, I was disappointed. And that got me into dealing with race initially. I got to where in 2010 I felt like I said all I had to say on it, and so I wanted to study other things, so I did. 2020, for whatever reason, because we've had shootings before, we've had you had Michael Brown, and you had other shootings before, but something about the Albury and then the Floyd just really kind of triggered something in me, and I actually pulled away for a little while. When I got back, I found there was more interest in what I had to say, and I knew what was out there was not working. So I felt a call, do I get back into this? Do I jump back into this? And I kind of didn't want to. I didn't want to write another book. My wife actually wanted me to write the book, and I didn't want to write the book. And so we compromised, and I wrote the book.
You always listen to your wife.
Yeah. But I think it was an important book to write because, I can refer people back to the book I wrote in 2006. I think it's very useful still. But still, you would want something updated, and I've learned more since then. So that made me want to put something new out there that I think might offer a path away from what we're doing today, which is just polarizing ourselves.
Yeah, that's helpful background, and I think it's an important conversation to have, and especially for apologetics. And those may wonder, like, why are we talking about racism and apologetics? I think most people just think it's apologetic methods, but we were talking pre-recording. I think this tends to be a more pervasive question among non-Christians about the Christian faith, is that I think there's kind of this wrong assumption, but an assumption nonetheless, that the Christians tend to be racist. And I think this is a question that we have to wrestle with, and a topic we have to wrestle with. And so I think that brings me to the next question. For those on the outside looking in, those who don't confess Christ, racism has cropped up as a big issue. And I think we talked to other people before. I think for us who we're not Black, for us, I think it tends to crop up as an issue for us. But for those who've always dealt with this, it's always been an issue. Not as much with us, but especially around election season and the candidates that evangelicals may endorse. So based on your research and personal experience, what do those outside the faith usually think about Christians around these racial issues?
Yeah, there's I've also studied anti-Christian bias in that time after I studied.
Yeah, and that was mostly what this question was
Yeah,
prompted by.
and that is one of the common perceptions of Christians is that they're bigoted, that they're racist, and that sort of thing. So that's pretty common. Now, we'd be remiss not to say that there's a racism problem within Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
There is. The question is it worse in Christianity than outside Christianity? I think that's a mixed bag. I think there's some research that suggests that it may be, other research that suggests that it's not. So I think it's a mixed bag on whether it's worse or not. Like what I say with more confidence is that Christianity itself does not lend itself to racism.
Yeah.
In part because when it developed, the whole notion of race was not out there. We didn't have a notion of race in biblical times. So you have that. And when you think about it, whites are actually less likely to be Christians than African Americans and Hispanic Americans.
Yep.
So if Christianity, the religion itself, was bent towards racism, one would think that would not be the case.
Exactly.
So I think you're on comfortable ground saying Christianity as a religion is not racist. I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, I'm thinking of research that suggests that Christians are more vulnerable to racism, depending on how you define it. I can also think of research that shows, what we call intrinsic Christianity is not that vulnerable to racism. Extrinsic Christianity is. So I think that's a mixed bag as far as we look at Christians. And to the degree it's a mixed bag, I think it is I don't know how to put this, a confrontation for us as to why it is a problem that we have this problem with racism, since our religion does not lend itself to that.
Yeah.
I think that's a challenge to us. That's probably what I'm looking for, a challenge to us.
Yeah.
To really think about those sort of things.
And at least historically, it hasn't been the case because Christianity came from the Middle East, and then first hit Africa, first hit Egypt.
Yeah.
Historically, like blacker or more colored or whatever it is, people groups, and then it finally hit Europe a few centuries later. So it started from those who were not white, and then kind of moved into those who were white. So if that's our history, then kind of where are we kind of moving from now?
I think you look at our history, and I think you can see the sort of dynamics. All right, so there's a lot of historical documents of Christians supporting slavery based on the Bible.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the abolition movement started off, for the most part, as a faith-based movement.
Yep.
The Christians were really running the abolition. So, are Christians more racist? Plenty of evidence that Christians in the South use their faith in order to support racism. Now, I don't think they were getting it from the intrinsic part of what Christianity is, but they're using their faith, just like they use evolution to do that as well.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you have Christians, the Gidley sisters, Wilberforce, these Christians who are actually pushing to the end of slavery based on their faith as well.
Yep. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, that makes sense, because unfortunately there's some people that claim to be Christian that try to redefine certain things that are in the Bible to support things like modern day slavery, when biblically slavery was completely different type of situation, context. So and also I really think it's great, as Christians we know that God's family, us being brothers in Christ and brothers and sisters in Christ across the world, isn't held to national borders, or it's all nations and all tongues. So if we really are truly Christian, it like you said, Christianity itself is very anti-racist. But unfortunately, there are people out there that claim to be Christian that try to redefine it into their own context. So good. Oh, go ahead.
One of the questions that I know people get is Christianity supports slavery, that it goes back to the Bible. Here's the thing you have to remember about this. That is taking us in the 21st century and projecting it back there.
Yep.
And here's what I mean by that. The Christians back there were not in the position we're at. If there was slavery in the United States today and Christians were voting for a pro-slavery candidate, you got something. Christians could not vote back then. The challenge Christians had back then was, okay, what do we do with people who own slaves and people who are enslaved? And how can we have one community? Now, I think that's a different question. And to try to pose our questions back then, I think is not an accurate thing to do.
Mhm.
And I think by and large, we look at the reasons of Paul, it was not an endorsement of slavery, it was an endorsement of building community. One could struggle with that, but it's not the same thing. I think we have to be very careful about that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and you argue two predominant paths of colorblindness and anti-racism have not worked and will not work to solve our problems and heal pain around racism, resulting from a thoroughly uh, racialized society. How can you define both colorblindness and anti-racism and what your proposed solution is for a better path forward?
Sure. So colorblindness is probably the easiest to define. It's just the way we defeat racism is we ignore race.
Mhm.
So that, when I look at a person, I don't see their race. I'm not going to treat you any differently by race. And so let's not even bring up race as a conversation.
Mhm.
Don't tell me you need to bring up race as to describe, someone running away from you to the police or something like that. Then, we don't need to describe race. That's colorblindness. And there is a little bit more complicated. Uh, in order to get an understanding, I read the literature on anti-racism by people who wrote it,
Mhm.
who were advocating. They said they were anti-racist. So this is not like CRT where people are saying, hey, these people are not CRT. They don't even claim to be CRT. These people who claim to be anti-racist.
Hmm.
And, there's a couple of tenets of anti-racism I think are quite accurate. They would be proactive. Their racism is multifaceted. But the problem anti-racism runs into, and I saw this again and again and again. So this is not like I pulled just one thing out of context
Mhm.
to see this issue. The problem with anti-racism is ultimately its solution is that whites must do what people of color tell them to do.
Hmm.
And that doesn't work. And the research shows that does not work, that diverse training does not result in prejudice reduction, that
Actually,
long-term
it's the opposite, isn't it? Like if you
you
have
can create a
diversity training, it
backlash.
actually
It's possible.
results
It
in
doesn't
less
always, but
diversity.
you can create a backlash
Yeah.
where people are actually, I don't want to say more racist, but less sympathetic to the
Mhm.
people of color due to diversity training. And I think part of it is that if we had this attitude, this is what we had to tell whites what to do, that comes through. I think that's part of what was happening.
Yeah.
That it can create less sympathy for marginalized whites, if you talk about privilege, but no more sympathy for marginalized people of color.
Hmm.
There's all sorts of problems with the anti-racism that the research has shown does not work.
Mhm.
So those don't work. I argue as a Christian, and my book is not, it's a Christian book, but
Yeah.
I don't go to
It's not in
theology
your
in all
face,
the
Christian.
chapters. I have one chapter where I say, hey, I'm gonna do the theology in this chapter.
Yep.
If you don't want to read about theology, skip this chapter, and
Yep.
you can do that, and the book flows just fine. But as a Christian, we should know that those are not going to work, because human depravity means when we say we're the solution and we're going to impose on others, and both groups try to impose their solution on others. We say that does not take into account that we as fallen creatures often have our own blind spots
Mhm.
that we don't see, and that we're going to try to put solutions that are going to work for us, not necessarily for everyone else. So my approach is that we got to have better conversations. We can't just talk at each other. We have to talk with each other.
Mhm.
And we can't just say, I have the solution and you have to do my solution, and then we have racial harmony. Even if I had the right perfect solution, me just saying that is going to guarantee a backlash, a pushback. But we can come together to find solutions together, then we all have skin in the game. And then we all can work together. And to me, building community is the way to stop our move towards polarization.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, before next question, maybe to tie it up, it's so what you're saying is color blindness is like, let's not even talk about race.
Mhm.
There's no distinction. And so like you kind of lose like personal qualities, and this is my background. I bring this to the conversation. Like those are flattened. So there's nothing you can really talk about. And so you just kind of avoid it. If
Yeah.
race comes into the conversation, let's just not talk about
And it's
that.
also
Versus
problematic. It's
anti-racism.
also problematic because it has an assumption that your race doesn't matter in your society.
Yeah.
And there's a ream of research showing that it does. It impacts our life chances.
Yeah. And anti-racism, like you're saying, is there's the dominant group and there's the there's the dominated group, and so the dominated group or the minority group, whatever you want to call them, they now control the conversation. They tell the ones who were formerly persecuting them or being racist towards them, whatever it was. They now have the right to basically tell them whatever to do, kind of like following whatever you do. And the people who are talked to, like, they're just told, hey, submit, just listen, and like you don't really have a voice in this anymore.
Yeah, I think that's basically it. I don't know people who, I'm trying to think.
They wouldn't say that, but I think that's like where like
right. I think that's what comes through. Now, the only thing I would say to hedge on is, can do whatever they want to say. I think some people would hedge on that, saying, no, we're not saying that, like you have to kill yourself or something like that. I mean, I think people could take that to a ridiculous amount. But if you really look at the literature, I mean, literally, it's like, hey, whites, why aren't you doing what people of color want you to do? Why aren't you giving money? Why aren't you listening and trying to do better? Why aren't that comes across again and again.
Yeah,
again.
it's just a one-way conversation
they may
versus
hedge
dialogue.
Yeah, that the people can say literally anything. And some people would hedge at that, but it really comes across that the role of whites is to do what people of color want them to do. I think the assumption would be that people of color would not be unreasonable, which once again does not take into consideration human depravity.
Got it. Okay.
And inevitably with this topic, at some point, politics is going to be part of the conversation. It's kind of in our culture, in our waters. It's going to be mixed in. Whether it's the left or right, both are probably guilty of, having some sort of political agenda drive what the conversation should be, versus what's good with being Christians is you can talk about politics for a while, but you're ultimately going to be leaning on scripture. And how like, maybe this is good advice even for other authors too. Like, how did you know deep down where your limit was on talking about the current context and politics and culture, and be like, okay, I'm not going to go any farther. I'm going to really lean primarily on scripture.
Yeah.
Especially concerning your chapter on the theological understanding of your approach. Are there parts of scripture that you find most helpful, even not just in this book, but in your life, that you turn to the most often?
Yeah, as I think about it, I think that I try to avoid partisan politics in this book. I really try to avoid, because I think that I don't want to signal to this book, this book's for conservatives, this book's for liberals.
I think you thread that needle pretty well.
What?
I think you thread that needle pretty well. It's
I try, I try to stay out of the current political situation of the day. I didn't know there's one section where I asked people why they voted for Trump, because I wanted to illustrate, listening to others. Other than that, I really try to stay away from politics, because I don't think that is the solution either way. I think that what is key is, I think there's a danger, and I know sometimes Christians have done this too, and I'm not excusing us. There's a danger in being so confident you're right that you can do whatever you want to get people to follow along. I think that happens in our politics, in our racial conversations, and a lot of things. I enter this thinking, I have my own arguments, I have my own ways I think, but I am not 100% sure I'm correct. So I have to leave it open for the fact that I need to be corrected sometimes. I think if we approach everything like that, then we can learn and we can work together. I think when we are confident that we cannot learn from others, I think that's when we have problems.
Yeah.
Before we move on, any just kind of the last part of the question too, any parts of scripture that you're kind of be your lifelong favorites that you keep going back to?
I look at the themes that I see, as far as human depravity. The Bible talks about, that we should esteem others before ourselves. As far as a specific Bible verse, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but these are just, I come back again and again on how, as Christians, our job is to recognize the depravity to value others, to serve others, image bearers, and to see them in that way. And that's sort of what I try to use to keep me humble.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Yeah. And that bridges well into my question, because knowing that we're depraved, knowing that we're sinners, there is going to necessarily be some blind spots that we don't see. You said this yourself too. And I think as well, and it's harder for those who are one side or the other to admit that there's strengths in the other side, which is something that you talk about in your book. So how is it, like, what are both some potential blind spots as well as possible strengths in both the colorblindness, quote unquote, and anti-racist, quote unquote, camps? And attached to this question, how would you, and you talk about this in your book, how would you best engage in conversation with people who align with either camp?
Yeah. I think the blind spot in the colorblindness, I think it's pretty evident in that colorblindness requires an assumption that things are basically fair. You have occasional races out there, but basic things are fair. And so, we could ignore race, and we could just move on and pretend that.
Yeah, as long as it's not overt, we don't have to talk about it.
Right, as long as it's not overt, that sort of thing. And this is why, people who have this mentality strongly, they resent it when you bring up racial issues. They think you're bringing up racial issues is a problem. And I'm not saying that there aren't people who bring up racial issues in an unhealthy way that are problematic, but given that we know that your race impacts how you're going to live your life to some degree, then it's got to be brought up. So I think that's a blind spot. The value of colorblindness is, they value equality, which is a good thing, which is something that we should value, which is something that's in the Bible. We're all equally fallen before God. So that's a strength that they have. They value equality. The blind spot for anti-racism, I think, is an unwillingness to recognize that people of color themselves can overcorrect and that justice can become revenge. That there's no really accounting for when I'm reading some of the stuff on anti-racism, I think, okay, what mechanisms do you have in place that this is not abused? What mechanisms do you have in place? If you're telling whites to listen to people calling to do better, as what D'Angelo tends to do, what mechanism do you have in place that person called does not use that to abuse that white person? And are you going to assume that that's not going to happen? Because that's going to happen, because people of color are no better or worse than anyone else as far as when it comes to moral. I think that's a huge blind spot. I think that's why a lot of the programs fail. The strength of anti-racism is that it does recognize the need for justice, that we do have to correct, the harm, and that those who misuse others should face justice, and the innocent should receive. I think that's a great thing. So one way to look at it is, colorblindness gives us equality, and anti-racism gives us justice. Both of those are good qualities. But, if you're just concentrating on quality, and you forget about, the inefficiencies of our system and how it's not always fair, then you're going to be unfair. Just concentrate on justice, that can spin out of control and turn into revenge. There really needs to be a balancing. And to me, the balancing comes in the conversations. I tell people, there are times where I'm colorblind. When I'm grading my students' tests, their race will not impact their grade. The quality of their work is going to impact their grade. There are times when I'm anti-racist. When I'm looking at some of the injustices that are out there. So I'm not saying that these things are unreasonably evil and, with no redeeming value. I think they have value. But like most things, if you lack nuance, it can spin out of control.
Yeah. You talk about in your book too, before next question, that there's some of the organizations that you're part of or that you've seen that have done this well. So maybe if you can shout out, like, how has this been done well that we can look to? It's like, oh, this is a good example of how we can do this.
There's an organization out, I think it's in Los Angeles, called Game Changers. that brought together people in the community and police officers. And at least they've had some short-term success with that. So, that's been an interesting organization. I think Rebel Angels, I've become more aware of them. They've not touched on racial issues, but they've been leading productive conversations. I think that they've done some good stuff as well. There are some churches that have had, that become multiracial. I used to write on multiracial churches, study them.
Yep.
And they found out ways to have healthy conversations. So we can see it here and there. It's not systematic in our society. We can see it here and there. But there's some organizations that are starting to do or have done some work in this area.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, and I think what you're saying, especially from a Christian perspective, is kind of like in the same vein as, Dr. King's message too. Just representing, how to, you know, be a Christian first and work across, work across race lines and everything. So, no, it's a good message. It's and knowing that I don't know if you had any, that was kind of like a random comment. I don't know if you had a response on that before I jumped into a question.
You talk about Dr. King a little bit in your
Yeah.
book too, and a few others, and how he's been either misused or how he's used
Yeah,
correctly. Talk about that too.
That's why, kind of
Yeah.
put that in. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think King, while like the rest of us has flaws, not perfect. I think his direction, because King was, if you look at, the Student National Coordinating Committee, or you look at, Malcolm X, and you look at one of the other movements, they were much more of, this is a Black movement. And King was, this is a movement for everyone. We're going to take in everyone, and we're going to move forward. Now, it's at a different time. And it's a time where that's where a protest was necessary, because you're clearly going against an overtly racist system.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
But sure, even in that protest, what he wanted was to have, bring people together. I think that we have to think along those lines. I'm not saying that we need to bring people together in a protest, because protesting, I think, has limited value today. I do think that that we need to find ways to bring people together to have communication, so that we can correct some of the remaining inequities we have in our society.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's, like you said, there's movements have their strengths and their weaknesses. So there's some that have strengths, like promoting more justice into the world and conversations, but there's also the weaknesses where it tends to be dominant on one voice or dominant on one background. So you were saying, there's different movements in the 60s when, again, racism was more overt because the laws were actually overt, kind of in your face racist. But Dr. King, instead of being like, we're a Black movement towards Black values, which were necessary because those were actually being kind of pushed against or pushed back on. But he said, no, we have people from every tribe, people, tongue, nation, and we're working to promote unity in society versus just for one people group, though they were still being more overtly pushed against at that time.
Yeah. He was much more unifying message for sure. So it's good. Thank you for, you said so much better than me.
Catching his drift. Yep.
No, I was talking to George. He said it's so much better than me, but it's Peter. You did too. That was good. So your book, or any book focused on racism, ethnic division, culture, you see it on the bookshelf, it might trigger some people. It might stir something up. They might have some sort of reaction from all sides. It's just kind of maybe a human. I don't know if it's in the culture today where it's just like out there so much where people might have a natural reaction to it. How do you hope your book will both edify Christians, and this is kind of like an apologetics episode, and those who may see Christians as racist? And again, kind of the most common critique I hear from atheists or non-believers is saying, "Oh, the Bible promotes slavery," and they don't have an understanding. I was like,
or
have you ever
Christians vote for racists, or Christians vote for people who don't believe in unity.
Well, and the kind of the response is like, well, Mr. Atheist, have you ever read the Bible? Do you know the biblical definition of slavery in the Bible, how it's different than today? So is Christianity a racist religion, or is it actually our best way forward for all races to unite in the worship of Jesus Christ? That was a pretty easy question.
Well, all right. Let me first go back to, how I hope to edify Christians.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that, as you probably know, that we are probably in a post-Christian world right now.
Yep.
Mhm.
That we can go into exactly how that's happened and what it looks like. We're in a post-Christian world where being a Christian isn't necessarily to your advantage in our society, whereas
Right.
in the past it was more likely to be to your advantage.
Yeah.
So we have this post-Christian world. Any post-Christian world, people are not going to come to your churches just because they feel obligated to. 40, 50 years ago, people felt obligated to go to church. They're not going to do that. And, maybe you could reach them there even if they weren't a Christian. So people are going to come to church or come to us if we offer them something they can't easily get outside the church.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that Christianity offers the keys to deal with racism.
Mm-hmm.
If we lived it out, then in a post-Christian world, we are offering people something they're not getting outside.
And you can't get outside.
Yeah. When you just imitate, be it colorblindness or anti-racism, what the world's doing, why would people need to go to church for that?
Yep.
So I think, if we were serious about having productive conversations and solving problems and taking leadership in solving problems, in a post-Christian world, I think that's going to open up doors to talk to people about Christ. And even if it doesn't open all those doors, at least make people not as hostile towards Christians. There are some people who are going to be hostile no matter what. They hate Christians, Christianity, fine. But there's people who don't care, but they could become more hostile, they become more accepting. At least those individuals, we would show them, hey, there's something here to that. So I think that is something that we have to do. We do the work, but we can become a more powerful witness in the post-Christian world. I've touched on Christianity is not a racist religion. That I think it's silly to even talk about that since race wasn't even a concept.
Right.
Christianity is being birthed. And people who want to say Christianity is a racist religion. I think you can argue Christians are more racist than other Christians. You can look at some data.
But that's different than Christianity is racist.
That's different. I think that we have to, rather than leading, protests against CRT or something like that, we should be encouraging people to have honest discussions.
Yeah.
I think we need to approach this differently. I think that we need to approach this as, hey, argument depravity means that whatever solution we're offering probably has weaknesses and blind spots. We need to talk to each other to find better solutions. We need to be at the forefront of pushing that. That's not going to disarm everyone's going to make that claim of Christians being racist. But more and more people, if we did that, more and more people would say, hey, the way you want to deal with racism, the Christians are doing with that. They're dealing with that. They're doing it with a healthy way. That, I think, over time can change the perception people have of Christians. And not everyone, once again, but enough people to where this notion of Christianity being linked to racism will go away. And then finally, we don't have Christians pushing slavery today in the United States, but people would argue some of our voting patterns are problematic. I don't want to get into partisan politics. What I will say is that regardless of who you vote for, if your candidate calls out, if your candidate is engaging in rhetoric that is harmful, hurtful, alienating, dehumanizing, Christians need to call that out. You may call out and say, I'm still going to vote for you, but you should not be saying this.
Yeah.
Because if you don't call it out, then you begin to own that rhetoric. So I think that's something that Christians nearly need to do in a much more serious way. I find some Christians are so busy demonizing Christians who vote differently from them instead of accepting and instead of calling out the alienating speech of some of their political candidates. I think that we need to concentrate more on the latter than the former.
Yeah, because you can find. Yeah, keep going, Nick.
I was just I like what you're saying, just like a natural reflection on that is it's calling us to be salt and light in the world, you know.
Yeah, it's easy to have division in the world. It's easy, like you said, to find an organization that's colorblindness or organization that's anti-racist. Like you go to a church that falls in either camp. You're like, well, I can just go to this organization that doesn't require anything of me, like really besides me believing the same stuff, versus a church that's having really, like you said, productive conversations. Like, oh, this is different than what I'm seeing in culture. That amongst all the things that we know, the churches that do preaching the gospel being paramount. But yeah, if we're doing the things right, then we're going to look different than the culture does, and that's kind of our job. Well, cool. Yeah. Before we end this, kind of last question, unless you guys have anything else to add to this, but last question is, you reference some of your other works and some other stuff that you've written and maybe that you're still writing or whatever it is, but where can you point our listeners to stuff that maybe you've written that you think may be helpful for them to read and engage with to help this conversation keep going, to where they can continually kind of have this in front of them as, okay, how can I engage in conversations around this in a healthy and productive way?
Yeah, I do have a website, georgeyancey.com, that you can look, and I post, my books, many of my books. I don't know if I post all of them. Many of my books on that. You do go to George Yancey, spelled Yancey, not C-Y. There's actually a George Yancey out there, C-Y, that people can with. Live for great fun. So yeah, so that's maybe where you can see some of the stuff that I've written, as far as on race and on anti-Christian bias and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'll just point there. Obviously, you can do Amazon, do a search for me on Amazon as well.
Cool. Well, Dr. Yancey, thanks for talking about this. Thanks for your research and thanks for what I think both Nick and I would agree on, and obviously you would agree on since you wrote the book. But really, truly like a better way forward than just kind of these two kind of opposite camps kind of yelling at each other, saying, "Hey, you're doing it wrong. No, you're doing it wrong. Let's figure out a better path forward." But yeah, thanks for your research on racism, for anti-Christian bias, these things that we can have more productive conversations on.
Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you.